The wind came hard that October, the kind that pulled at the tin roofing and whistled through every crack in every building on the Miller property. Ethan Miller stood at the edge of his soybean field and watched the last rows fall under the combine header, and he felt something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It had been a bad year. Not the worst. He had seen worse, or at least his father had, and told him about it enough times that it felt like his own memory. But bad enough. Rain came late in the spring, then didn't come at all through July and most of August. The beans were short. The corn across the road looked tired and beaten down, like a dog that had been kicked too many times. And now, with harvest barely finished and the dust still hanging in the air behind the combine, Ethan had to decide what to do with all of it. He was 46 years old. His hands were cracked and dark around the knuckles, permanently stained with grease from years of fixing things that should have been replaced a long time ago. He wore the same Carhartt jacket his wife had bought him 11 years back, patched twice at the left elbow. His boots were Red Wings, resoled once, the leather scuffed white at the toes. He drove a 2009 Ford F250 with 243,000 miles on it, and he was proud of every single one. The Miller farm sat on 1,100 acres of flat Iowa ground, about 14 miles south of a town called Grinnell. It wasn't a big operation by modern standards. No GPS-guided planters, no yield mapping software, no drone flights over the fields. Ethan did things the way his father had done them and his grandfather before that, by feel, by instinct, by getting up before the sun and not sitting down until it was gone. Some people admired that. Most people just thought he was stubborn. His father, Harold Miller, had died 7 years ago. Heart attack in the machine shed on a Tuesday morning in March. One hand still on the wrench he'd been using to fix the auger motor on grain bin number 3. They found him on his back on the concrete floor with his cap still on and his eyes open, like he'd just laid down for a minute to look at something on the ceiling. He was 69 years old and had never taken a vacation. Harold had built those grain bins himself. Not bought, built. 4 of them, steel-walled, flat-bottomed, each one holding about 15,000 bushels. He poured the concrete pads, welded the floor supports, bolted the wall sheets together one by one with a ratchet and a level and a stubbornness that bordered on clinical. It took him 3 summers. People said he was crazy, that he could rent commercial storage for less than the cost of the steel alone. Harold never argued with them. He just kept working. A man who can't store his own grain, Harold used to say, is a man who has to sell when somebody else tells him to. Ethan thought about that phrase a lot, especially now. The letter arrived on a Monday, printed on heavy cream-colored paper with a logo embossed at the top. Ridgeline Agricultural Partners, LLC. Ethan read it, standing at the kitchen counter, with a cup of black coffee going cold in his other hand. The language was polite, professional, almost warm, but the number at the bottom of the page was anything but. Ridgeline was offering forward contracts on corn and soybeans at prices that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Corn at $3.85 a bushel. Beans at $9.10. These weren't negotiable, the letter said. These were preferred regional rates available to qualifying producers for a limited enrollment period. Ethan set the letter on the counter and stared out the window. His reflection looked back at him from the dark glass, tired and thin. He knew what Ridgeline was doing. Everyone in the county knew. They had come in fast over the past 2 years, buying up elevator capacity, locking in contracts, squeezing out the smaller buyers who used to compete for grain at harvest. They weren't the only game in town, but they were becoming the biggest one. And when the biggest buyer sets a price, the smaller ones tend to follow. $3.85 on corn. The cost of production, if you didn't count labor, if you didn't count the mortgage, if you didn't count the diesel or the seed or the fertilizer that had gone up 22% since last spring. It was a price designed to make you feel grateful for breaking even. Ethan folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the others. By the end of that week, he learned that most of his neighbors had signed. Dale Prentice signed first. Dale farmed 800 acres north of town and had an equipment loan coming due in December. He told Ethan about it at the co-op while they waited for fuel. "I don't love it," Dale said, not meeting Ethan's eyes. "But I can't afford to gamble either. You know how it is." Ethan nodded. He did know how it was. Then the Schroeders signed. Then Bill Keller. Then the young Peterson kid who had just taken over his uncle's place and didn't know any better and was scared out of his mind about making the first payment on a quarter section he probably shouldn't have bought. One by one, the farms around Ethan locked in at Ridgeline's numbers, and one by one, the conversations at the elevator and the feed store and the Sunday church parking lot shifted from "What are you going to do?" to "Why haven't you signed yet?" Ethan hadn't signed. He hadn't signed because of the bins. The 4 grain bins stood in a row behind the machine shed, silver gray and dull, their paint faded and chalky from years of sun and wind. They weren't pretty. The roofs had been patched more than once, and the access ladders were rusted in places, and one of the aeration fans on bin 2 made a sound like a cat caught in a dryer. But they were tight. Harold had seen to that. Every seal, every bolt, every gasket, Harold had gone over them with a craftsman's obsession that bordered on love. Ethan spent 3 days after harvest running every bushel he had through those bins. The auger motors whined and coughed, and he replaced a bearing on one and rewired the control panel on another, and by the time he was done, all 4 bins were full to within 2 feet of the eaves, corn in 1 and 2, soybeans in 3 and 4, roughly 60,000 bushels total, sitting quiet in the cool, dark steel, waiting. His wife, Karen, watched him from the kitchen window on the 3rd evening as he climbed down the ladder of bin 4, his jeans gray with dust, his hands black. "You're really not going to sell," she said when he came inside. Ethan pulled off his boots and set them by the door. "Not yet. Dale says beans might go lower. Dale signed at 9:10. Dale sleeps at night." Ethan looked at her. Karen was a practical woman, 5'4", with reading glasses that she wore on a beaded chain around her neck and a way of stating facts that left no room for argument. She wasn't angry. She was scared. "I know it's tight," Ethan said. "Tight is when we skip the vacation. This is the mortgage." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the sink. "Your father would have done the same thing," she said quietly. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't a criticism either. It was just the truth. November came, and with it, the bills, property taxes, insurance, the last installment on the seed corn, a repair bill for the combine that Ethan had been putting off since September. The numbers piled up on the kitchen table like dead leaves, and Ethan sat with them every night after dinner, moving them around, adding and subtracting, looking for room that wasn't there. He could have sold. At any point, he could have called Ridgeline, taken the contract, deposited the check, and paid every bill on that table, with enough left over to get through winter. At any point, he could have made the knot in his stomach go away. But every time he reached for the phone, He thought about his father standing in the grain bin doorway, hands on his hips, squinting into the light, saying, "The market always comes back. The question is whether you're still standing when it does." And every time, he put the phone back down. The talk in town got worse. People weren't unkind. Not exactly. But they had that particular rural way of expressing concern that felt an awful lot like judgment. "Ethan's sitting on his grain," they said at the diner. "Heard the Millers haven't sold a bushel. Stubborn, just like his old man. Hope he knows what he's doing." They didn't say the rest of it out loud, but Ethan could hear it anyway. That Harold Miller had been stubborn too, and Harold Miller had died on the floor of his machine shed with a wrench in his hand and nothing in the bank but pride. The worst conversation came at the elevator in mid-November when Ethan ran into Vince Dollar, the regional manager for Ridgeline. Vince was a tall man with a polo shirt tucked into pressed khakis and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He drove a black Chevy Tahoe with company plates and smelled like aftershave and conference rooms. "Ethan," Vince said, offering his hand. "Still holding out on me?" "Just waiting for the right time." "The right time was 6 weeks ago, friend. Market's soft, demand's flat. You've got 60,000 bushels aging in bins that your daddy built in 1990 whatever." He smiled that half smile. "I can still get you in at $3.90 on corn. Call it a courtesy." Ethan looked at the hand Vince was offering, then at his face. "I appreciate that," he said. He didn't take the hand. Vince shrugged. "Suit yourself, but those bins aren't going to pay your mortgage." Ethan drove home with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He parked the truck by the machine shed, got out, and stood in the cold looking at the 4 bins lined up in the gray light. The wind pushed at him, steady and mean. He put his hand on the steel wall of bin 1. It was cold, bitter cold, and under his palm he could feel the faintest vibration from the aeration fan running inside. He closed his eyes and stood there for a long time, just listening to the hum of the grain drying slowly in the dark. "Tell me I'm not crazy," he said to no one. The wind answered, and the bin hummed, and that was all. He walked around the bins that evening like a man checking on livestock. He opened each access hatch and shined a flashlight inside, looking at the grain. Golden corn in bins 1 and 2, pale soybeans in 3 and 4, and the light caught the surface and made it glow like a lake at sunset. The smell that rose out was warm and dry and sweet, the smell of a season's labor held in stillness. He breathed it in and held it, the way you hold the scent of something you're afraid to lose. At the base of bin 3, he found a mark scratched into the concrete pad. 2 letters, HM, and a date, 1993. His father had carved them there with a masonry nail the day he finished pouring the last foundation. Ethan had been 15 years old that summer. He remembered watching Harold smooth the concrete with a wooden float, his forearms brown and thick with muscle, sweat running down his temples, and how his father had paused at the end and knelt down and scratched those letters with a deliberateness that made the boy understand, without being told, that this was not just a building project. It was a claim, a statement of intent. Harold Miller was here, and Harold Miller built this, and Harold Miller would not be moved. Ethan crouched down and ran his thumb over the letters. The concrete was rough under his skin. He stayed there for a while, in the cold, in the gray light, listening to the bins breathe. The next few days were long. Ethan checked the aeration fans twice daily, monitoring moisture levels with a probe he had inherited from Harold, a simple brass instrument with a dial face, old-fashioned and precise. The grain had to stay below 15% moisture for corn, 13 for beans. Too dry and it lost weight at the scale. Too damp and it would spoil. And everything, the gamble, the waiting, the marriage stretched thin as wire, would be for nothing. He walked the bins at dawn and again after dark, checking the temperature cables that hung inside each one, reading numbers off a panel that Harold had wired himself with cloth-wrapped cable and soldered connections that looked like the work of a watchmaker. The system was old. Some of the gauges flickered. But it worked. It had always worked. On one of those evening walks, a memory came to him uninvited. He was 10 years old, and it was a July afternoon so hot the air shimmered above the gravel driveway. Harold was on top of bin 2, replacing a roof vent, and Ethan's mother had sent him out with a glass of lemonade. Real lemonade, with sugar and seeds floating in it, and ice that was already half melted by the time he crossed the yard. He climbed the ladder one-handed, holding the glass, and Harold took it and drank it all without stopping, and wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist and said, "Your mama makes the best lemonade in Iowa." Then he looked out over the fields, which were green and tall and perfect, and he said, "You see all that? Someday you'll have to decide what it's worth to you." Ethan hadn't understood then. He understood now. December was the hardest month. Karen took a part-time job at the veterinary clinic in town, answering phones 3 days a week. She didn't say it was because of the bills, and Ethan didn't ask. Their son, Tyler, came home from Iowa State for Christmas break and helped with chores. And for a few days, the house felt full and warm and almost normal. But on Christmas Eve, after Tyler had gone to bed and the tree lights blinked softly in the living room, Karen sat down next to Ethan on the couch and handed him a piece of paper. It was a printout from the bank, their checking account balance. The number had 4 digits, and the first one was a 1. "We have until February," she said. Ethan looked at the number. Then he looked at his wife. Her eyes were red but dry. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. "I know," he said. "If the price doesn't come up, I know." She took the paper back and folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. And they sat together in the blinking light, not touching, not talking, each one carrying a weight that the other could feel but couldn't lift. That night, Ethan lay awake and stared at the ceiling and listened to Karen breathing beside him, and he thought about his father. Harold had been through the farm crisis of the 80s. He never talked about it much, but once, late at night after Ethan's mother had gone to bed, Harold had poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass and told his son a story. In '83, Harold had said, corn was $2.10. Land prices fell 40% in 1 year. Banks were calling loans on farms that had been family-owned for 3 generations. Everyone sold. Everyone panicked. And I watched my own brother sell his quarter for 30 cents on the dollar to a man from Des Moines who had never touched a plow in his life. Harold had taken a long sip. "I didn't sell. Your mother thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I built those bins that summer, and I stored every kernel and I waited. And by '85, the price came back. Not all the way, but enough. Enough to hold on. Enough to still be here." He had set the glass down and looked at Ethan with eyes that were old and tired and absolutely certain. "Patience isn't a gift, son. It's a decision. You decide to wait when everything inside you is screaming to move. That's all it is. A decision you make every single morning until the morning you don't have to make it anymore." Ethan lay in the dark and breathed. February. He had until February. January passed like a slow fever. Corn held at $3.90. Beans hovered around $9.20. Ethan checked the markets every morning on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee that Karen made before she left for the clinic. The numbers stared back at him, flat and merciless. He started skipping meals, not on purpose. He just forgot. He'd be out in the machine shed, working on the combine header or changing oil in the tractor, and he'd look up, and it would be 2:00, and he hadn't eaten since 6. He lost 8 pounds in 3 weeks, and didn't notice until Karen mentioned that his belt had a new hole punched in it. The isolation settled over him like a second winter. He stopped going to the co-op unless he absolutely had to. He stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize. At church on Sundays, he sat in the back pew and left during the last hymn, before anyone could corner him in the vestibule with well-meaning advice or pitying looks. One afternoon in late January, he drove to the county courthouse to pay the second half of his property taxes, late with a penalty, and the clerk, a woman named Barbara, who had known his family for 30 years, looked at the check and then looked at him with an expression he recognized instantly. It was the look people gave you when they were already composing your story in their heads, the story they would tell at dinner about the Miller boy who held his grain too long and lost the farm. "Everything all right, Ethan?" she asked. "Just fine, Barbara. Thank you." He walked out into the January sun, which was bright and cold and gave no heat at all, and he sat in the truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes with the engine off, staring at the frost on the windshield before he trusted himself to drive. The neighbors stopped asking. That was almost worse. They had moved past concern into a kind of quiet pity. The way people look at a man who has made a bet, everyone knows he is going to lose. Dale Prentice waved when he drove past, but didn't stop. The Schroeders brought over a casserole, which was what people in Grinnell did when someone was dying or going broke. Ethan ate the casserole. It was good. There were moments in those long January nights when he nearly broke. Moments when he lay awake at 3 a.m. and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of 60,000 bushels pressing down on him as surely as if they were piled on his chest. He would think about the numbers, the mortgage payment due in 14 days, the insurance premium, the seed order that had to be placed by March if he wanted to plant on time. And his heart would beat fast and thin, and his hands would curl into fists under the blankets, and he would think, "This is how my father felt. This is what it costs." But then morning would come, and he would get up, and he would walk to the bins, and he would put his hand on the cold steel, and he would listen, and the bins would hum, and he would decide, one more time, to wait. The first sign came on the 3rd Tuesday of January. Ethan was in the machine shed, rewiring a hydraulic valve on the grain cart when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his friend Ray Whitfield, who ran a small grain brokerage out of Marshalltown. "Check beans," the text said. Nothing else. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the market app. He looked at the number. Then he looked again. Soybeans, $10.45, up $1.25 from last week. His hands were shaking. He set the phone on the workbench and pressed both palms flat on the steel surface and stood there, breathing. Then he picked the phone back up and read the headline beneath the price. A winter storm system had destroyed a significant portion of the South American soybean crop. Argentina and southern Brazil had been hit hard. Export demand was shifting. Buyers were scrambling. Ethan read it again, then a third time. He didn't call anyone. He didn't tell Karen. He went back to the hydraulic valve and finished the repair, and his hands were still shaking when he tightened the last fitting. By the end of that week, corn had jumped to $4.60. By the following Monday, beans hit $11.80. By February 1st, the month Karen had circled on the calendar as the deadline, the wall, the end of the road, corn was trading at $5.15, and beans were at $12.90, and the phone in the Miller kitchen was ringing off the hook. Ridgeline called first. Vince Dollar himself, his voice 2 shades warmer than it had been in November. "Ethan, hey, just checking in. We'd love to talk about moving some of that grain you've been holding. We can offer some very competitive spot prices." "I'll bet you can," Ethan said. He was standing at the kitchen window, looking at the bins. The morning light caught the steel and turned it pale gold. "I'll be in touch, Vince." He hung up before Vince could answer. The elevator in town called next, then a broker from Cedar Rapids, then another one from Omaha. Word had gotten out that Ethan Miller had 60,000 bushels sitting in bins, unsold, uncontracted, free and clear, and suddenly everybody wanted to be his friend. Ethan didn't rush. He waited 3 more days, watching the price climb, checking the forecasts, reading the reports Ray Whitfield sent him every morning. And when he felt the moment was right, not perfect, but right, he made the calls. He sold the corn at $5.35 a bushel to a regional buyer out of Des Moines. He sold the soybeans at $13.10 to an export terminal in Davenport. He sold all of it, every bushel, at cash prices that were, on average, 38% higher than the contracts Ridgeline had offered in October. He did the math on the back of a seed corn receipt, sitting at the kitchen table with the same pencil his father had kept in the cup by the phone. After expenses, after taxes, after every bill on that table was paid, the property taxes, the insurance, the combine repair, the mortgage, the seed corn, the fertilizer, all of it. Ethan Miller cleared a net profit of $94,000. He had not borrowed a dollar. Karen came home from the clinic that evening and found Ethan sitting on the front porch in his father's old rocking chair, which was weathered gray and creaked with every push. The February air was cold but still, and the sun was going down behind the grain bins, throwing long shadows across the yard. She sat down next to him. He handed her the seed corn receipt with the numbers on the back. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took off her reading glasses and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and her shoulders shook once, hard, and then she was still. "You stubborn man," she said. "Runs in the family." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh. Really laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and real, since before harvest. They sat on the porch and watched the light fade. The bins stood behind the machine shed in a row, quiet now, empty, their steel walls ticking as the last warmth of the day left them. The aeration fans were off. The auger motors were silent. There was nothing left inside but air and the faint, sweet smell of dried grain. In the weeks that followed, the news spread through Grinnell the way all news spreads in small towns, slowly at first, then all at once. Ethan Miller had held his grain. Ethan Miller had waited out the market. Ethan Miller had paid every bill and saved his farm without signing a single contract or taking a single loan. Dale Prentice came by one Saturday morning, standing in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, looking at the bins. "I should have listened to you," Dale said. "I didn't say anything. That's what I should have listened to." They stood there for a moment, 2 men in work, jackets, and dirty boots, looking at 4 steel bins that an old man had built by hand 30 years ago, because he believed that a farmer who couldn't store his own grain was a farmer who couldn't control his own future. Vince Dollar drove past the Miller farm once in his black Tahoe, slowed down, and kept going. He didn't stop. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the frost was out of the ground, and Ethan was in the fields, running the cultivator through last year's stubble, turning the dark Iowa soil over in long, clean rows that stretched to the horizon. The air smelled like wet earth and diesel and something green that hadn't arrived yet but was coming. Tyler called from Ames to say he'd made the dean's list. Karen quit the veterinary clinic because she didn't need the job anymore. The combine got its overdue repair. The machine shed got a new roof. And the grain bins got a fresh coat of silver paint, the first new paint they'd had in 12 years. Ethan did that, himself, on a warm Saturday in April, standing on a ladder with a roller and a 5-gallon bucket, working his way around each bin while the meadowlarks sang from the fence posts and the field stretched out, green and flat, in every direction. The paint went on smooth and bright, and when the sun hit it, the bins looked almost new. Almost. Not quite. You could still see the places where Harold had welded the patches, where the steel had buckled and been hammered straight, where the seams didn't line up perfectly because they had been fitted by hand and not by machine. But those imperfections were the point. They were the proof that someone had cared enough to build something and maintain it and pass it on, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. Ethan climbed down from the ladder and stepped back and looked at the 4 bins shining in the afternoon light. He thought about his father on that concrete floor, wrench in hand. He thought about his mother, gone 5 years, before Harold, who used to bring lemonade out to the grain bins on summer afternoons. He thought about Karen on the porch with the receipt in her hands. He thought about all the mornings he had woken up and decided to wait one more day. Patience isn't a gift. It's a decision. Ethan Miller picked up the paint bucket and the roller and walked back toward the house, where Karen was planting tomatoes in the garden, and the radio on the porch was playing something soft and old and country. And the whole farm smelled like paint and soil and the beginning of something good. He didn't look back at the bins. He didn't need to. They were still there. They would always be there. And so would he.